This week's main presenter is a member of our own community. Jamie Naetzker has been a Houston Oasis for more than a year and a half. When she's not reading about the economy and social justice, she keeps a desk warm by doing data stewardship in the oil and gas industry. She and her husband, Stephen, are expecting their first child in a month, at which point Jamie's research interests are most likely to shift towards the alphabet shapes and colors for a while. Please welcome Jamie Naetzker. Jamie?
Good morning, everyone. As you said, I'm Jamie, and my husband and I don't come all the time to Oasis. We're kind of on an irregular schedule these days, but I'm glad to be here today to talk about a topic that has interested me lately, which is universal basic income and how it relates to the coming AI revolution. So what got me interested in this is a book I recently read by Andrew Yang called The War on Normal People. Andrew Yang is a businessman. He describes himself as a serial entrepreneur. He has started multiple companies in his relatively short life. He's only in his 40s. Most recently, he's the founder and CEO of a company called Venture for America. And what this company does, it recruits young college graduates who are interested in starting a business. It trains them, and it gives them seed money and sends them out to various cities in the country that are struggling economically, places like Cincinnati, Detroit, Baltimore, San Antonio, Charlotte. It sends them out there to help try to revitalize these communities through starting new businesses where they aren't being started. So revitalizing our middle America that has been struggling for a while now is one of Andrew Yang's interests. That's why he started this company. He's also running for president in 2020. I learned about Andrew Yang listening to Sam Harris's podcast, Waking Up. He was a guest recently on that podcast. And Andrew Yang was talking about this idea of universal basic income and how with all of this automation that really is bursting through in a whole new, bigger level now, it's ready to just take the place of so many more millions of jobs. He believes that we really need to have a safety net in order to address that. He believes universal basic income is how we're going to do that when all these jobs go away to automation. And he believes that political action and him running for president is how he's going to get that done. So he's very passionate about this idea. I've read his book, and I'm going to share some of his ideas with you. So what is universal basic income? What it is the government will provide a basic living stipend to every citizen with no qualifying criteria whatsoever. You can be rich or poor, employed, unemployed, disabled, able-bodied. Every single person gets the same basic living income just for being a citizen. Well, why do such a thing? So we are on the cusp of artificial intelligence replacing much of the routine work that humans currently do. It's just getting that much more sophisticated now to where we already have factories, we already have smartphones and smart houses and prototypes, and it's just really getting ready to burst forth on a much more sophisticated level and replace a lot of the things that we thought that technology could never replace, and doing it just in a larger quantity and in many more sectors than before. Well, you may say, okay, scaremonger, I've heard this before. We had the agricultural revolution where we transitioned from small farms to big farms, and we introduced some heavy machinery like tractors. 40% of our employment used to be in agriculture, and it went down to 2%. Well, those people went out and they found new jobs. Or we had the Industrial Revolution. We went away from the individual artisans. We had factories and assembly lines. And what happened is we had more service sector jobs. So there's always new jobs to take the place of the old. So stop scaring me. We're going to have new jobs that come to take the place when all these robots come in. Well, this is only true to an extent. So if you look at this chart up here, this shows how many new jobs have been added to the U.S. economy over the past 4 decades. Back in 76 to 85, 23% new jobs were added to the economy. The following decade, 86 to 95, 18% new jobs were added. The following decade, 96 to 2005, 12% jobs were added to the economy. And in 2006 to 2015, only 4% new jobs. The trend is very clear on the bar chart there. Fewer and fewer jobs are being added each decade. So new jobs are being created, but not as many as are being lost. Now let's take a look at where the most people are working in the country today. This is data as of 2016, so fairly recently. Overall, there are 140 million employees, and the 5 largest sectors of employment are office and administrative support, sales and retail, food preparation and serving, transportation and material moving, and production, or in other words, manufacturing. So this is a pie chart of the same data here. You can see these sectors over here make up about half of all of the jobs in our country. And the scary thing is that all of these categories are in immediate danger of being replaced by automation and artificial intelligence. We have the technology right now to do this. Trucking is probably the most immediate cause for concern. Self-driving cars and trucks are entering the marketplace as we speak. They're already in service. In Colorado and Nevada, self-driving trucks made successful deliveries last year. In Australia, Rio Tinto, a mining company, has a fleet of 73 autonomous trucks that carry back iron ore from their mines 24 hours a day. And back in 2016, Europe saw a convoy of self-driving trucks cross the continent successfully. So it's already being implemented to a degree, and more is to come. Companies are also investing in this technology. Uber bought the self-driving truck company Otto, and it employs 500 engineers to perfect the technology now. Google spun off its self-driving car company Waymo, and Waymo is now working with Daimler and Volvo on self-driving trucks as well. So they're very interested. These are companies we've all heard of, at least, Google and Uber and Volvo. So these companies are very interested, and they're pursuing this technology right now. So you may say, well, is this really realistic? Because I've heard stories of self-driving cars, and they weren't necessarily positive. There have been some fatalities. A robot or a technology cannot see things as well as a human eye, and I just don't think it's ready for prime time. I don't think that it's going to happen soon. Well, Jim Scheinman is a venture capitalist who invests in self-driving cars and trucks companies. So he does his research because he invests his money here, and he believes that self-driving trucks will become mainstream before cars because highway driving is just much more straightforward than urban driving. Anyone who's taken a road trip recognizes this picture here. Looks nothing like our Houston freeways during rush hour. It's more wide open, there's clearer markings, fewer intersections. It's way more straightforward to drive on the highway, which is where the majority of your truck driving is happening. So this is a problem that we will solve earlier than urban self-driving cars. There's also significant incentives to have mainstream self-driving trucks. Financially, they wouldn't have to pay for the labor of the truck drivers. They would have reduced fuel costs. You can have them follow close and benefit from the reduced wind resistance, reduced fuel cost, increased productivity, and then accidents. These truck drivers, they drive 11-hour shifts. They're trying to put food on the table. They get exhausted. There are accidents. The companies have to pay out damages. So all of these reasons are very, very large financial incentives to pursue this technology, in addition to human interest to reducing fatalities and injuries and loss of life. So it's definitely coming soon. Well, how soon? Tesla actually now offers an automated freight truck. This is a picture of it. Elon Musk also said that in 2019, all new Teslas will be self-driving. They're just scrapping the old model of the car that you drive yourself, and the cars are going to be self-driving from now on. And other autonomous vehicle companies report similar timelines, with 2020 being the first year of mass adoption. So we're talking next year and the year after. These companies are saying, driving your own car is old news. All of our vehicles are going to be self-driving. This is happening very soon. And how many jobs are we talking about losing here? Well, there are about 3.5 million truck drivers in the company. And in addition to that, there are as many as 7.2 million workers who exclusively or primarily support the needs of those truckers at the rest stops and truck stops, fast food and diners and motels. So in your rural areas, you're driving through these long stretches and you just see this rest stop on the road. There's a Wendy's there, or there's a gas station, or there's a motel. Well, the only reason that exists is because people are driving through there, and a lot of these people are the truck drivers, and it's their job carrying their freight. So if all these truck drivers go away, now it's just automated, it's going to be a huge economic hit, and a lot of these rest stops are going to have to close. They're not going to be economically solvent anymore, so they're all going to lose their jobs as well. Well, what does this mean? Andrew Yang believes that the loss of trucking jobs will have a similar fallout to the loss of manufacturing jobs we have already experienced in this country. You can see this chart here. It goes back to about 1980 at this relative high part, and then we have a steep drop-off here starting in 2000. Back in 2000, there were still 17.5 million manufacturing workers in the United States, and since then, more than 5 million workers have lost their jobs. 80% of that was due to automation. And what happened to those 5 million workers? A Department of Labor study in 2012 found that 41% of displaced manufacturing workers between 2009 and 2011 were still unemployed or dropped out of the labor market entirely within 3 years of losing their jobs. So you have to keep in mind when you're hearing about the unemployment statistics that they tell you. I think the latest one I heard was about 4%. That doesn't include people who just stopped trying entirely. They just stopped looking. Maybe they went on disability. Maybe they're living with mom and dad. But if they're not looking for work, they're not considered unemployed. Well, look at this graph here. This is not specific to manufacturing. This is all of the labor force in the country, but it tells a similar picture. Back in 1950, we had about a 59.2% participation rate in the labor force. And remember, not as many women were working back then, so women became more and more in the workforce, and we have this steep increase here up to about the 90s is the peak at 67%. And then we have a steep drop-off to 62.9% in 2015. So a drop of 5%. Add that 5% to your 4% unemployment statistic, and it's not really looking so good anymore. So we're talking about 41% of displaced manufacturing workers in recent years. What happened to them? Well, a lot of them became destitute and applied for disability benefits. Here's another graph. I don't know if you can tell the difference between these lines. This top line is employed to working age population ratio. The peak up here around 2000 is 64%. Then in the recession, 2007 to 2008, there's a steep drop-off. It hasn't really recovered. It's at about 59% as of 2015. So we haven't recovered the drop there that we experienced during the recession of employed people. This other line is a disabled to working age population ratio. And you see it's a steady increase from about the mid-90s up through, it levels off in the last few years. But it has about doubled in that time period, the percentage has. So disability rolls shot up in 2000, starting in 2000, rising by 3.5 million. The numbers increased dramatically in states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and other manufacturing-heavy states. So a lot of these people, they lost their jobs. They're in rural areas maybe, and there's no other jobs immediately available to them, at least not in that area. And a lot of them go on disability. Well, you may be curious, that doesn't make sense. This person was recently working. They were able-bodied. How can you just decide to go on disability? Well, the biggest growth categories of disability are mental disorders and musculoskeletal and connective tissue disorders. Together, those comprise about 50% of disability claims, which is double what they were 20 years ago. And the thing about these two categories is that they are the hardest to independently verify for a doctor. So our technology is not perfect yet, and if you say, oh, I have an ache in my shoulder, it doesn't feel quite right, my back hurts all the time, the doctor can't necessarily find anything on an MRI, but that doesn't necessarily mean that nothing's wrong. It's just the technology can't see it yet. So in a way, sometimes it's just based on the patient report. Similar with a mental disorder, you go to the psychiatrist, you say, I just feel depressed all the time, I can't get out of bed, I have no motivation. Well, psychology really is in its infancy, and a lot of the treatment and the practice of psychology is based on patient report as well. So it's hard to independently verify these things. We have disability belts in our country that track areas of joblessness. The highest rates of disability benefits are the Deep South and Appalachia, which are also some of the most economically depressed areas in the country, and it's not a coincidence. So and a lot of times we're talking about economic disability here. This is people's only recourse to have some sort of income stream and put food on their table. Well, you may say, okay, I don't really like that these free handouts are being given by the government. They're taking advantage of the system, but at least they're getting an income. So why do they need this universal basic income? They're figuring it out. Well, economic researchers Ann Case and Angus Deaton did a study in 2015, and they found a sharp increase in mortality rate among middle-aged white Americans. Starting in 1999, there was a 0.5% increase each year for 16 years. And this is virtually unheard of in a developed country for an increase in mortality rate for more than a couple of years. And they looked at possible causes and found that suicides and overdoses also sharply increased during this period. So they point to the loss of jobs of these people. They no longer have the sense of status of being a contributing member to society. They no longer have the community that they had in their workplace. So they just feel at a loss, they feel disconnected, and they're either committing suicide intentionally or getting roped into drug addiction and overdosing. Well, what does UBI have to do with any of this? Andrew Yang proposes we institute a universal basic income to all Americans aged 18 to 64, indiscriminately with no qualifying criteria whatsoever. He proposes an amount of $1,000 a month or $12,000 a year, indexed to increase with inflation. And the same amount will go to rich and poor alike. He really sees it more as a supplement instead of an income replacement. There would be no sort of penalty for going out and improving your situation, getting a job, or getting a better job. It's just the same amount to every single American, and there's no, it's not linked to disability, it's not linked to being poor at all. Well, how would we afford all of this money going to every single American? So Yang proposes a value-added tax, which is a consumption tax, to pay for this at a level of 10%. And the reason he proposes this, some of us care very much about the fact that some of our largest corporations are really great at avoiding paying their taxes. They hold their money overseas so that the government doesn't really have a good resource to touch it. Apple has $230 billion overseas that it's just holding there to avoid paying taxes. Microsoft has $124 billion, and Google has $60 billion. And all of this is money that the U.S. government would like to be able to get its fair share of taxes from and cannot do so. They can't find a way to get them to pay up. Now, a value-added tax, according to Yang, would be much more difficult for these companies to avoid. It's paid whenever you buy goods or employ services, so it's baked into the process of doing business. And how it would work is, so your hedge fund billionaire who spends $10 million a year on private jets and fancy cars, at 10%, he'd be paying $1 million into the system, and he would receive his UBI of $12,000. A single mom, given her needs and what she realistically can afford and needs to spend, she'd probably end up paying about $2,500 in this value-added tax, and she would get her same $12,000 UBI. So most of us would probably come out ahead from this. If you do the math, you'd have to spend more than $120,000 in a year on goods and services in order to be worse off. So I think the vast majority of working Americans would come out ahead based on this system. If you are really, really spendy, well then you're going to be spending more than you receive from the UBI. And UBI is already in practice or being researched in various places. Believe it or not, right here in the United States, something similar to UBI is practiced in Alaska. Alaska. They have something called the Petroleum Dividend dating back to 1982. The government owns a lot of the oil and gas resources in Alaska, and they decided at one point they should pay back this money in a dividend to their residents. Every single resident receives a check from the government just for living in Alaska. Currently, it's between $1,000 and $2,000 a year for every resident. And they've been doing this for over 30 years, and they've measured the results of what has happened on account of this. And what they've seen is poverty has decreased by a quarter in Alaska since they've established this, 25%. Alaska is also the second lowest income inequality in the country. They've noticed that newborn or infant birth weight has risen, so expectant mothers can afford to feed themselves better, and they can feed their infants better because they have more money in their pockets. And they've also noticed that at least 7,000 new jobs have been created on account of this petroleum dividend because people have more money to go out and spend and stimulate the economy. Some countries around the world are running some pilot programs. They're worried about the same things as Andrew Yang in terms of automation taking away all of these jobs. Finland, India, Canada, the Netherlands and Scotland are all running some trial programs. We don't really have results yet, but they're very interested in the idea. Iran has been running something like UBI since 2011. When they had to cut back their oil and gas subsidies, they started to give $16,000 a year to each resident. And what they've noticed is that people aren't working fewer hours. If anything, they're expanding their businesses as a result of this additional money. And in Oakland, California, Sam Altman, who is the head of a technology firm called Y Combinator, he's just taken it upon himself to run his own little pilot program out of his own pockets. He chose 100 families, and he's giving them between $1,000 and $2,000 per month, and just measuring the results, planning to do it for 5 years. So he started this last year, and we don't really have the results of that either yet, but he's examining it as well in Oakland. Well, you may say, all right, that's fine for Scotland, that's fine for the Netherlands. We're not a socialist country. There's no way that we would ever do free money to all the citizens in this country. And you may be surprised to learn that a form of UBI almost became law in this country back in 1970 and 71. It passed the House of Representatives twice before stalling in the Senate. It was very actively considered about 50 years ago. And versions of UBI have been championed by various thinkers across the political spectrum over the past decades and even going back hundreds of years. So way back in 1796, Thomas Paine was talking about UBI. So it's not a new idea at all. It's more than 200 years old. And more recently, Martin Luther King, President Richard Nixon, economist Milton Friedman, Bernie Sanders, Stephen Hawking, not exactly a political figure, Barack Obama, and some billionaires and CEOs, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg. All of these people have made statements in support of UBI, and most recently, it's largely in recognition of the fact of the coming automation that's going to take away a lot of jobs. So a lot of people are interested in this idea. That's probably about all we have time for today, so does anyone have any questions?
Thanks, Jamie.
Jamie, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm personally on the fence about a UBI, but just that, because I see a lot of gray in that. But what do you think your thoughts on other things such as and I emphasize the words a methodical renegotiation of NAFTA and GATT, not the reckless way that Trump is doing it, but a more methodical way of NAFTA, so we're not having our manufacturing workers competing with people who make 10 cents an hour, and a federal jobs guarantee. In other words, do what we can to increase jobs, to have incentives to work, as opposed to just giving people just money for the sake of it. But your thoughts on that? And that's something I'm on the fence with, by the way. So
all right, I didn't hear everything you said, but you just said find ways to increase jobs and stimulate job growth, or?
Yes, through a methodical renegotiation of NAFTA and GATT, not the way Trump is doing it, but to really negotiate it so we're not having our workers compete with workers overseas who make 10 cents an hour, and a federal jobs guarantee. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I have to claim ignorance. I don't think I'm really an expert on whether NAFTA is a good or a bad thing, and whether it's, there are people who say that protectionism is good and keep our jobs here, and there are others who say, well, it's short-sighted, and you're increasing jobs because you're not taking away the jobs that are now we get imports from, but you're decreasing our export opportunities. I really don't know where I come down.
Hey, so thank you so much for that talk. I think you did a wonderful job sort of laying out the coming issue. So I, too, listened to the interview with Andrew Yang, and I guess it's not clear what's going to happen, but I kind of have a couple criticisms of this that I think might be worth discussing. So one is, so you mentioned that that disability curve is going up over time, right? And I think my concern is those people are receiving money right now, and yet the suicide rate has been increasing. There's a plight, this death of despair. So if we just give free money, I don't know, how is that going to fit with the data that we currently have, right? That's one. Two would be, we live in a free market system, and if you give people, I think if you isolate it, it might work, but if everyone's wealth increases, the market and the prices are going to reflect that. And so you're essentially going to start this vicious cycle of increasing prices and then more redistribution, and then increasing prices and more redistribution to match that. So I don't know how this could work without some sort of price controls. If you have anything, there's two things to talk about, and I don't know if any of that's covered in Andrew Yang's book. But that's my 2 points and concerns. Thank you.
Well, Yang does address the first point about aren't people just going to go waste this money, or actually you didn't quite say that. You said the disability it's linked to the suicides. So, and I don't know that we can actually prevent people, especially who are already addicted, prevent that cycle with the UBI. They're probably still in a very bad place, but so one point that Yang makes is that he does not mean this as a income replacement, since work does provide meaning to people's lives. It's $12,000, and most of us would not be comfortable living on $12,000. If anyone has any ambition whatsoever, they want to go out and improve their situation. If they have children, they want to provide well for their children. It brings everyone up to the poverty line, but there's no disincentive to go beyond that. You still get your UBI if you go out and you can get a job. You still get a UBI if you get a super great job. So there's no disincentive to work or to make a lot of money. And it's really just a first step as well, because there are concerns about just what are people going to do with themselves when there really are no more jobs, and the UBI doesn't really address what do people do with themselves. He does have other suggestions for that, so there are other problems we have to brainstorm and solve as well, but the UBI is an attempt to address, at least make people solvent and still be able to put food on the table when all these jobs go away.
Yeah, I think it's important to make a distinction over here. Sorry. I think it's important to make a distinction between expert systems and artificial intelligence. I mean, what we're talking about in terms of the UBI at the moment is you developing expert systems as a slave workforce, which can subsidize the rest of us. I see a separate problem coming from artificial intelligence, and I think you've spoken to it, although I'd like to hear you elaborate on it, and that's that when AI really develops, when you really do have electronic systems that are intelligent and we would recognize as being an entity, that at that point we're not going to be the major thinkers on the planet. And I think what we're headed for is a crisis of meaning in our lives. And I think that, yeah, you can talk about UBI at the moment, but and I think we'll transition through that. I really do. But I think what we really need to be discussing is what's going to happen when we're outthought.
Right. So if I understood correctly, you're saying, what do people do with themselves when there really are not jobs to be had? Is that right? And I think that's something that we're just having to start to figure out right now. And Andrew Yang does talk about it a little bit in his book. He mentions time banking. There are a few mostly rural communities in this country, about 200, that do something called time banking. Basically, you buy and receive services, or you give services or receive services, and your time is banked at the community level. So if you are like a single mom and you need a handyman to come make some repairs, or you need yard work done or something, you can make a request to the time bank, and somebody else who, just feels your plight and wants to help out, they go help you out with your repairs, and they will earn time credits for that. I'm not sure if it's has a monetary value other than someone else can volunteer for you, but Yang envisions this kind of alternate currency where, when the robots are taking care of the big stuff, we can still be a cohesive community and volunteer back and forth, so we can still create meaning for ourselves and be industrious and not just lie around.
That is unfortunately all the time we have. I know we had quite a few other questions. Jamie, you going to be at lunch today?
I will.
All right, so she will be at lunch, ready to answer your questions about the AA revolution and NAFTA, whatever you want to know. Thank you very much. Let's thank Jamie.